Hello everybody, welcome back to another video lecture. So today we're taking a look at John Stuart Mill. Now, of course, we've already taken a look at Mill earlier in the course when we were doing our unit on ethics, so we already have a sense of who this fellow is. Now, we looked at his work on utilitarianism, so his moral philosophy. Now, today we're going to look at some of his political philosophy on liberty. Now, Mill himself thinks that these two pieces are compatible with each other. So he thinks what he's doing in moral philosophy and political philosophy are really, in some sense, two sides of the same coin. We're going to see how that works out, though you don't have to be a utilitarian to think Mill is onto something when he's doing his political philosophy, or vice versa. If you think he's wrong when it comes to political philosophy, you may think there's still something going on correctly in his moral philosophy. So really, part of what's going to be going on there is your views on to what extent moral and political philosophy form a continuum, and to what extent we can have some sort of clear break between the two. So as I mentioned earlier, political philosophy is normative. It's really about questions of values and how we should do things, not just how things actually work. So there are connections between moral and political philosophy, but you can draw a line and distinguish between how you think a community ought to be organized, what sorts of issues ought to be matters of law, that is, what sorts of issues that we actually force people to act in certain ways or do certain things, and where we think people really ought to have freedom to do what they think is right, independent of what the community around them thinks is right. As we're going to see here, Mill really argues in favor of the broadest, well, almost the broadest domain possible for individual freedom. So in that way, he's quite a bit like Nozick, but he's also quite a bit like Rawls. So there's, as we were looking at Nozick and Rawls, they certainly disagree when it comes to questions of distributive justice. Should we have taxes? Should we have publicly funded schools and healthcare and things like this? Rawls says yes, Nozick says no. There's more to it than that, but that's a very quick summary. Now, both Rawls and Nozick, despite their disagreement over questions of wealth and property, have broad agreement that individuals should have a very broad array of freedoms. Now, we're going to see that coming out of Mill here. Mill gives a different way of trying to justify that than Rawls does. So in some sense, Nozick just presupposes we have these rights. Rawls uses the original position in the veil of ignorance to come up with the two principles of justice, the first one of which is the liberty principle, this guarantee of a broad array of rights. And Rawls, the way he gets to that is really that if we didn't know who we were in society, both on moral grounds and out of self-interest, we would want that array of liberties so we could pursue the good life as we see fit. We're going to see that Mill has a very similar sort of idea, but with this connection to utilitarianism, Mill ultimately justifies that broad range of rights on utility, which is something that Rawls does not do. So with that, let's just go ahead and jump in, take a look at what Mill has to tell us here. So really, starting in chapter 1, Mill talks about ways in which individuals can be oppressed, or a word he likes to use, tyrannized. Now, of course, individuals can have their freedoms restricted by direct acts of the government. You can make certain things illegal. But in a society where you have a social majority, Mill says you can also have what he calls the tyranny of the majority. And this is when, rather than the government directly oppressing people or tyrannizing them by making certain things illegal or persecuting them in a straightforward and identifiable way, what you have instead is really the social majority forcing their views on a social minority somehow. And you can think about examples of this when it comes to issues concerning religious views or social customs or sexuality. So what's really the difference here between government-sanctioned oppression and the tyranny of the majority? Well, it's really where you've got something that is formally or technically legal. So it's not that the government is actually coming out and saying, oh, it's illegal to belong to this religion, or it's illegal to engage in this kind of social custom, or it's illegal to have this kind of sexual orientation or something like that. But there are still social pressures. And Mill thinks this is something that we need to guard against and guard individuals against. And we're going to see in the next lecture, Young agrees with this and thinks that a lot more comes out of that than Mill thinks. But Mill thinks we need to protect individuals against this, particularly people within a social minority, from the tyranny of the majority, that social pressure that can come. But in particular, when that social pressure in a democracy can build up to something like an official government sanction. So if you're living in a democracy, which of course Mill was living in England at the time, the United Kingdom more broadly, which was a democracy, more limited form of democracy than what we here in Canada today would think, or say in the United States. But it certainly was a democracy, it still is a democracy. And if you're living in a democracy, there's a question there. To what extent should the rights and freedoms of people in a minority be protected? Because of course the basic idea behind a democracy is that what the majority says goes. So if you have a social majority in a democracy, that tyranny of the majority can quickly take the shape of official government sanction and official government restriction. So what should we do here? Well, one idea is to protect certain rights of individuals against interference from the majority through the mechanisms of government or even society. And so we're going to see ultimately what Mill argues for is that we should protect individual rights. So we should have a liberal democracy. So if you've ever heard the term liberal democracy, what differentiates a liberal democracy from just a straightforward majoritarian democracy is that in a liberal democracy, certain basic rights and freedoms are really being guaranteed. Right? There are certain, there are different ways of doing this, but there are certain rights that are on the constitutional level, say, which are protected in a way that simple majority votes, say in a legislature, can't override. So Mill is really arguing for something like this. Having certain individual rights, a certain domain of freedom be circumscribed within our political and social organization that allows individuals to do whatever they want in the way that they want it, and only have the government really directly interfering with what he calls the public sphere, when people are engaging with each other in a way that's not necessarily voluntary, and then allowing within society a very broad range of freedoms, including freedoms of discussion and so on, so we can talk to each other and try to convince each other about what's right, but not force each other to live in certain ways. Okay, so this gives you some sense of what the tyranny of the majority is. Really, when a social majority is forcing their views on a social minority, and this can, in a democracy, or even not in a democracy, but particularly in a democracy, take the form of direct government action. So this is where Mill articulates what he calls the harm principle. And this, like in his works on utilitarianism, he formulates this one principle to tell us really his main thoughts on what's going on. This time, the harm principle is really what tells us where the limits on government should be, government interference in individual lives. So he says the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. That's really what matters. It's preventing harm that justifies interference in somebody's free choices. So what does this mean in practice? Well, this means we can't have paternalistic laws. We can't have laws or other mechanisms to interfere in somebody's choice just because we think it's better for them if they make a choice one way than another way. The only time we are justified in interfering in an individual's choice is when their choice would harm others without the other person's consent. So what does this mean? Well, look, if you consent to, I don't know, getting in a boxing match or something, well, then that's fine. You might get hurt, but it was your choice. The harm principle would justify us in restricting somebody from, saying, walking down the street and trying to engage in a boxing match with unwilling participants. That is, walking around and just punching people in the face or something. You can apply this in any other way as well. So look, the harm principle would certainly justify us in stopping people from, say, drugging somebody else against their will. But the harm principle means that governments cannot rightly restrict people from, say, consuming whatever sorts of drugs they want. Even if we know the drugs are really dangerous, even if we know they might be highly addictive, even if we can point to all sorts of other potential harms to the individual that might be suffered as a result of taking them, Mill says, you can't rightly have a law that restricts people from doing it. Really what you have to do is try to talk to them and convince them that taking those drugs would not be the right thing to do. That is, you have to really change their minds, and ultimately it's up to them to make decisions about what they're going to do. So you can convince people, you can exchange reasons, you can try to argue, you can do anything like that, but you can't actually force someone, right, against their will, to do something you think would be in their best interests. The only time you can interfere with their choice is to prevent harm to others. Now, at least on the surface, that sounds pretty nice, right? But there are some interesting questions that come out of this. And we're going to see in the Young lecture next time, some of these get explored at least to some degree. And those questions are, what exactly constitutes a harm? So getting punched in the face against your will certainly sounds like a harm. Any sort of physical injury sounds like a harm. But there are other sorts of harms that aren't so obvious that they are a harm in the right sense that they'd be covered by the harm principle. What about a certain kind of mental harm? Say, offending somebody's dignity by speaking about them in a certain way. What about just causing general offense? You know, you wear a shirt or something that has some foul language on it, and that upsets certain people who just really don't like seeing or hearing foul language at all. Does that count? Have you now harmed them if you've worn this shirt and out in public and they see it? What about harms to property? Right? If you damage somebody's property but don't actually hurt them, is that covered by the harm principle? It seems like it would need to be. Otherwise, the theory Mill's putting forward here has this pretty large, obvious hole in it. So given that harm doesn't seem to encompass only physical harm, it seems to encompass more than that, there is a real question that left outstanding by the time Mill has done his discussion in the whole book. Of course, we're only looking at a bit of it here, about what exactly is supposed to constitute a harm. And in a lot of ways, that's where a lot of the interesting discussion over to what extent can the majority in a liberal democracy legislate, create laws, and really enforce restrictions on individual liberties. Preventing harms to others sounds great. What does that mean in practice? Far more difficult to determine. All right, so we've got this harm principle, but there are restrictions on it. Not only are there these questions about what exactly constitutes a harm, but the harm principle doesn't govern everybody. As Mill puts it, liberty as a principle has no application to any state of things anterior or before to the time when mankind have become capable of being improved by free and equal discussion. So ultimately, Mill thinks that the harm principle isn't somehow this principle that's just sort of out there floating that's true. He doesn't have a view that we have certain rights that are just independent of questions of utility. In fact, Mill explicitly rejects that. He says, ultimately, his views here are grounded on utility in the broadest, longest possible sense. So he's really thinking about the aggregate utility of humanity as a whole. That gets served by liberty, right? We become happier overall when we are free to start living the way we see fit and, in some sense, really experimenting with different ways to live. So because Mill thinks the harm principle ultimately is justified by an appeal to utility, it's only when the conditions are right for liberty to actually help increase utility that the harm principle is justified in being applied. So this results in certain restrictions. That is, humans who have immature mental faculties aren't governed by the harm principle. So when you heard the harm principle, you might have thought, well, what about children? This doesn't quite seem like the right thing to do with children. If you let children do whatever they want except what's going to harm them, they might really not turn out very well once they've grown up. Mill agrees. He says, look, really what I'm talking about here are autonomous agents, people who can reason about what to do, think about their own interests, look at what other people are doing and other ideas presented to them, and really make up their own minds. So children don't count here. Children aren't governed by the harm principle. We can tell them what to do so long as it's in their own interests. Same with people who have, say, severe mental disabilities. Mill says, now he leaves it a little bit open here, but really if we have someone who doesn't seem like they have mature mental faculties, well, they too can be governed for their own benefit. And this is where we get into a bit of a question that brings us back to Midgley about whether or not we have something like degrees of personhood along with which come certain degrees of rights. So, you know, say children, if you have like a very small infant, perhaps right, has certain rights, of course, should be protected and so on, but doesn't really have the freedom to make an awful lot of choices about what they're going to do. As they become progressively more mature, their mental faculties develop and so on, then presumably they would start getting more and more autonomy, more right over what they themselves are going to do. Same with people who have their mental faculties impaired somehow. They may lose part of their autonomy and be governed over as well. And then I put this in here just to sort of show the piece, warts and all. Mill includes in this discussion of where the harm principle doesn't apply. He says it doesn't apply to those backward states of society in which the race itself may be considered as in its non-age. What does he mean here? Well, he's really articulating 19th century racial thinking and thinking about different groups of people as different races of humans. And those different races have different features, different characteristics, including levels of maturity. So really what he's arguing for here, and if you look in the text, he spells this out quite explicitly. Liberty is a principle, so really the harm principle applies to these mature societies, these mature races of people. And any society or group of people that we could consider themselves being somehow still in their childhood, their immaturity, not being fully grown yet, not having full mental faculties that can benefit from the exercise of this much freedom, they too can be governed for their own benefit just like children. Now, is Mill right? Almost certainly not, but it's worth bringing up here just to give a little bit of a history of this kind of thinking. So here we have one of the best known liberals from the 19th century, and here he is still arguing in favor of a version of colonialism. If we think that there are certain groups of people who really can't benefit from governing themselves, they can be governed for the purpose of their own benefit. Ultimately, what's the aim? To get all people to that mature phase so that they can benefit from this kind of freedom. But it betrays a rather old kind of thinking that Mill has this in here. And so I'm bringing it up just to show that even in a piece like this, that is in many ways very progressive for its time, you can still have these, in some sense, rather terrifying little bits in them. Okay, so we've got the harm principle. It's supposed to apply to mature humans. That's, I think, really the short version, right? Not supposed to apply to people that don't have mature mental faculties. And now, here again, there's a very interesting question, how exactly we define that, right? How do you figure out exactly what those are? That's a good question, but we can at least have some very rough sense of what's that like if we just sort of look around and look at adult humans and just ask questions about, on average, what sorts of abilities are there and so on. When we start getting into the territory of actually limiting people's freedoms, that's when I think a lot more care needs to start being taken and figuring out exactly where to draw those lines. Okay, so we've got the harm principle. We know it applies to humans with mature mental faculties, but there's a bit of a complication. Mill thinks we can also be responsible for harms that occur to other people, not just because we make them happen to other people, but because we prevent them from happening to other people. So there are really two kinds of responsibility, positive and negative responsibility. In positive responsibility, so if somebody subscribes to positive responsibility, they think we're responsible for what happens to other people because of what we do. Right? Virtually everybody believes in this. So you can think of positive responsibility as sort of the default responsibility. So going back to my example, with the boxing or something, if you walk down the street and just punch somebody in the face, you're responsible for the harm that they receive as a result of being punched in the face because you're the one that did it. If you hadn't have done it, then they wouldn't have been harmed in that sort of way, right? If you, whatever it might be, whatever results directly from your actions, or even perhaps indirectly, there's an interesting question there as well about how we draw those lines. You're responsible from what results from your actions. Now, negative responsibility is really this view that we are also responsible for what happens because of our inaction. So you're responsible for what happens because of what you don't do. Thinking back to utilitarianism, Mill has this example: if there's a child drowning in a pond and you're able to wade in or swim in and save them, if you don't do that, you're responsible for the child's death. Right? Maybe not quite just as much so as if you had gone in and drowned them yourself, but you are responsible for what happens if you could have prevented it and didn't do so. Now, because Mill believes this, he thinks that we can, in fact, coerce people to do certain actions in the public sphere. We're going to see how he defines that in a moment. If their inaction would cause harm to other people, because that would be a violation of the harm principle. So he gives a few different examples of this. One example he gives is if you are in a position to, say, testify in court to show that somebody is, in fact, innocent, when right now it seems like they're guilty based on the evidence. If you don't testify, you are in effect harming that person, because if they are found guilty and then punished in some way, and in that sense harmed, you could have prevented it. So in not doing so, you're really responsible for the harm that befalls them. Similar to the drowning child example, Mill also talks about if you're in a position to really save someone from some kind of abuse or some kind of harm or problem befalling them, then you have to, in fact, save them. He also points to taking part in the common defense, so things like the general defense of the community, say serving in the army or something if there's a war going on. He says there again, to not take part in that would be, in some sense, to be actively contributing to the harms being caused. So we get a little bit of a mixed bag here. The harm principle really says the only time we can coerce people is to prevent harm to others. Well, it turns out that we can coerce people to prevent harm to others, even if that means forcing people to do a certain kind of thing. Now, we still have this restriction in place, though. Mill ultimately thinks that government coercion ought to be limited by these questions of harm. So whenever we're thinking about a law or a way that government can tell people what to do, we always have to have the question in mind: what harm or set of harms does that kind of coercion actually prevent? And if we can't answer that question well, if we can't say, here are the sorts of harms that would be caused if we allowed that behavior to occur, and that's why it's illegal, then Mill thinks there's an unjust restriction on liberty. Okay, so we were just mentioning the public sphere. So Mill thinks we can coerce people to do certain actions in the public sphere if it's going to prevent harm to others. Well, what is the public sphere? We saw Held back in the ethics unit actually question this distinction between the public and private sphere. We have a very clear articulation of what that's supposed to be here in Mill. I'll leave it up to you to think about whether or not Held's right that these are really two areas that overlap so much that trying to distinguish between them the way Mill does is just silly. It's just not going to work. So the public sphere is really that sphere of activities and events that affect people without their consent. And this is where the harm principle applies. So think about walking down the street or being on campus or out at a restaurant or anything like that. Being in a place where you're likely to be around and be able to affect people without their explicit consent. So look, you might be at a restaurant or something, somebody else is at a restaurant. It's not that the two of you are there to see each other or that you're really consenting to both be there. It's that you're both there because you both want to take advantage of that situation, right? You want the good that comes from taking part in that activity or being in that place. You don't necessarily want to be there with all those other people. So this is really where the public sphere is really where people are doing things and interacting with each other, not always in ways that they consent to. And this is where that harm principle applies. Now, the private sphere is really the activities and events that affect people only when they voluntarily consent to them. And Mill adds a caveat or a kind of qualification. It's only that kind of voluntary consent that doesn't involve deceit or coercion. So if people are tricked into giving consent or coerced into giving consent, that itself is something Mill thinks is harmful, and we can use the harm principle to try to restrict that kind of behavior. But if people genuinely are taking part in activities or events or socializing with each other only in ways that they consent to, then the harm principle doesn't apply there. All right? Because of course the harm principle is really only supposed to be applying in the public sphere, and saying that's really where government coercion, government intervention, at least in some cases, can be justified. But in the private sphere, and you can conceive of this in somewhat different ways, but, in the privacy of your own home or something like that, the government really has no business telling you what to do, is the idea here. So what does this mean in practice? What sorts of freedoms do we get? Well, Mill maintains that in practice, having the harm principle as our limitation on government intervention means that we're going to have absolute freedom of conscience, expression, tastes and pursuits, forming groups of consenting individuals. And in fact, if you pull up the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and you compare it to Mill's text, you find virtually the same list. Same if you look at, say, the and you'll find it rather explicitly in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. If you look in something like the American Bill of Rights or other constitutional documents and other liberal democracies that guarantee certain basic freedoms, you typically find a list awfully similar to what Mill's is. Now, Mill tells us that the only freedom which deserves the name, freedom, is that of pursuing our own good in our own way, so long as we do not attempt to deprive others of theirs or impede their efforts to obtain it. So really, what is it to be free? To lead your life as you see fit, to pursue the good in your own way. That is, thinking back to Rawls, we have reasonable pluralism. We disagree about what the good is, about what's good for me to do or what's good for you to do. I might have views about what's good for me. You might have views about what's good for me. You probably have views about what's good for yourself. I have views about what's good for yourself. And we're going to disagree on that. Even if we agree on what sorts of things overall would be good, say, as goals, we might disagree on the right ways to try to attain those goals. Say you and I both agree that it's good for people to be happy. And so that in practice, you think doing something is going to make you happy, and I disagree. I think that's actually going to make you unhappy. Well, what Mill is really arguing here is that to be free is to pursue good in your own way. That is, to pursue it in the way that you think is going to be best, without somebody else telling you exactly what to do or how to do it, in the sense of coercing you to do it. Right? Now, because we have absolute freedom of conscience and expression and tastes and pursuits and forming groups of consenting adults, we still have quite a bit of social room in which to engage with each other. And Mill actively encourages us not to take the kind of liberalism and the kind of freedom that he is championing here as a kind of excuse to ignore each other, to disengage with each other, to all retreat into our own private spheres and only engage with each other in the public sphere as little as possible. In fact, he encourages exactly the opposite, that what we should have is a very vibrant public sphere where people engage with each other and in fact communicate to each other about what they think is right and wrong, what they think is good or bad, what sorts of activities they think are worth pursuing and which ones aren't. To use certain sorts of social pressures to encourage certain sorts of behaviors and discourage other sorts of behaviors. So Mill does think in terms of rights, in terms of the domain of law, in terms of the domain of coercion in that legal government sense. That should be restricted quite a bit, right? The harm principle should really try to limit that to a very small cluster. But then when it comes to the broader social questions about how to live and what to do and who to associate with and what to believe and so on, this is where Mill thinks we should be as free as possible to engage with each other, to share ideas, even when those ideas include condemning the activities of other people. So if you and I disagree on what the good is and we live our lives in different sorts of ways, Mill absolutely defends our right and our freedom to engage with each other about it and exchange our reasons, to tell each other that we think the other person is getting it wrong and why we think they're getting it wrong and what they should do instead. So he absolutely defends and encourages a very robust public sphere where people are constantly engaging in each other's and producing what is often called the marketplace of ideas. So if we think about, just in economics, a marketplace as somewhere where different sorts of goods come and get traded. People will take the things that they want for prices that they think are fair. Similar sort of thing, we can use a similar kind of conception when it comes to ideas and think about a marketplace of ideas where all the different ideas of humanity, just like all the different goods that we make, come, they stock the shelves in some sense, and people come through freely and take what they think is best, right? They take the ideas that they find most appealing for the reasons they find most appealing. They're willing to pay the price, so to speak, of having those ideas and living that kind of life. And Mill thinks that this is precisely what we should be trying to encourage. This spills us into chapter 2. So we ought to limit, when it comes to these questions of limitations of speech, we just saw on the previous slide, Mill is really encouraging the broadest possible range of freedom of thought and discussion, right? Being able to tell each other only what we want. Now, if you've got a democratic government, one that really responds to the will of the majority, however exactly that gets determined, such a government is likely only going to try to limit free speech in ways the majority would want. But even Mill thinks that this is unjust. And this is precisely where we see that tension between majoritarian democracy, right? Majority vote or majority choice goes, and this question of individual rights and protections. So even if the majority of society, say 90% or 99% or whatever it was, as big a majority as you want, thought that we should silence a certain kind of speech, Mill thinks that's wrong. Right? Say you've got a large majority, and they all think, I don't know, let's just pick a atheistic speech, right, ought to be made illegal. Mill thinks that's wrong. Why? Well, really for two reasons. First, he thinks that we're fallible beings, right? Sometimes we just get things wrong. Second, we're also progressive beings. Given the opportunity, we will exchange truth for error in that free marketplace of ideas. If we can see that one idea is wrong and another one's right, we'll adopt the correct one. If we, in fact, encounter a wrong idea in that marketplace of ideas, and we think about it and we look at it, so let's just stick with this atheism example, right? Let's say we are in a very strongly theistic society. There's a very small minority of people who engage in atheistic talk, right? They deny that God exists or say things that seem blasphemous or so on. Let's say as well that the majority of people actually want that kind of speech to be made illegal. right? 99% of people on some referendum vote yes, we should make that kind of speech illegal and it should be subject to a fine and imprisonment of up to 30 days or something. Mill really argues that that would violate the harm principle, even if that's what everybody wants, or the vast majority of people want in the society. It would still be wrong to institute that kind of law because it limits the freedoms of the individual in a way that goes beyond the harm principle. And when it comes to questions of speech, why is it wrong to do that? Well, because we're fallible and we're progressive. So there's really two possibilities, right? We're thinking about these people who are engaging in atheistic speech against the theistic majority in our society, whatever it is. The people who have the atheistic views might be right or they might be wrong. Now, Mill thinks no matter which one it is, there's still value in preserving the freedom of speech and expression there, and preserving this free marketplace of ideas, precisely because in a free marketplace of ideas, one free from coercion as much as possible, ultimately, over time, truth is going to win out. Truth is going to be best served. Our beliefs are going to become better over time in that kind of situation. So there's really, sticking with this example, there's two possibilities. Our small atheistic minority going around and saying these blasphemous things and these atheistic things. Either they're right or they're wrong. Now, let's just assume they're wrong, right? Our small minority of atheists going around saying what they want to say freely. Well, look, let's just assume they're really wrong, right? The theistic majority has it right. Well, in that case, there is a value in allowing those atheists to go around and keep talking about what they're talking about. Why? Well, it gives an opportunity to other people to think about what they're saying, to hear the best arguments, the best reasons in favor of those atheistic positions, and ultimately to see why they're wrong, right? If we allow discussion to go on unhindered without government coercion or social coercion, right, of the kind that would really result in restrictions on what people can do, and that's something different from telling them that they're wrong or not associating with them voluntarily or that sort of thing. Mill thinks there is a dividing line there. As long as the people, right, going around with these views are wrong, other people are going to realize it and in fact come to better know why they're right by engaging with the reasons for an alternative conclusion and judging ultimately those reasons and those conclusions themselves to somehow fall short. Now, on the flip side, given we're fallible, we have to seriously entertain the possibility that we're wrong. So say we've got our atheistic minority and they're going around saying all these things we don't like, and we're part of the theistic majority. What if they got it right? What if we're actually wrong? Well, if we use government coercion, we make it illegal for that small group of people to go around freely communicating their ideas and so on, we're really depriving people the opportunity to hear the truth and to then change their beliefs, to reject old false beliefs and gain new true ones. So ultimately, Mill thinks this free marketplace of ideas is justified precisely because we are these fallible progressive beings. Given the opportunity, we'll reject false beliefs and hold true beliefs. There's a value even into hearing reasons for false beliefs, precisely so that we can hear those reasons, we can hear the best possible case for whatever the view might be, and then see why it's not a very good case. So look, instead of atheists, maybe I'll just pick on, I don't know, flat earthers or something. Should it be illegal for people to go around arguing that the earth is flat? Mill says no, not at all, right? That the right that they have to make that argument should absolutely be defended. They should be free to do it. Now, that doesn't mean you have to think they're right. That doesn't mean you have to, join some sort of flat earth club or something. But what it does mean is that they are free to go around making that argument, finding the best possible reasons to support that conclusion that the earth is flat. That gives the rest of us the opportunity to then engage with those ideas, to evaluate those reasons. If in fact they're really bad reasons, then we're going to see how bad they are, and be even more confident that the Earth is spherical. Right? Alternatively, if we really got it wrong and the flat earthers really got it right, and of course, presumably most of us don't think that, because of course we all think we're right about everything all the time, but imagine the flat earthers really got it right. Then by them being free to go around and share the reasons, right, the good reasons, let's now assume, for why we should believe the Earth is flat, then we can actually come to realize that we were holding a false belief and exchange that false belief for one that's supported by better reasons, right? Hopefully a true belief, though of course we can never really be certain whether or not the beliefs we're holding are true or they aren't. So really I'm going to just close on this point here and bring it around to this question of harm. And this is really what we're going to see Young pick up on in the next lecture. So Mill defends a pretty extreme version of freedom of speech. People should be free to say just about anything they want. And of course, he thinks the combination of us being fallible and progressive is really what justifies this. Now, there's a question here about whether or not Mill has been a little bit overconfident about human nature. Is it always the case that on a free marketplace of ideas, people are going to exchange false beliefs for true beliefs? Maybe, maybe not, but there's a pretty interesting question there about how reasonable or how rational most people are. Now, in addition to that, even if we set those worries aside, there are also questions about whether or not certain forms of expression or speech themselves can cause harm. So earlier when I was talking about what it is that causes harm, well, obviously a kind of physical harm seems to count. A sort of harm to property almost certainly counts. Mere offense doesn't seem to count, right? Say using some foul language or something and somebody doesn't like it. Because, you know, if that would count as a harm, just using some foul language and somebody doesn't like it. If we go back to my atheist example, some theists might be truly offended by the atheist going around and even being free to speak their mind and share their reasons for why they think they're correct. What if we go even more extreme? So earlier, I had this little bit in the slide where Mill's talking about, you know, races of people, and we can consider the whole race to be in its non-age. That there's whole groups of people who are basically like children and need to be governed for their own benefit. Now, it's a kind of racist thinking, right? There's just no two ways around it. What about things like racist beliefs? Should we defend the right of people to freely express those in public, right? Should we defend the ability of you know, pick whatever racist group you want, to be able to have some big parade in downtown Lethbridge with big banners with racist slogans on them that are, right, as explicit as you want, full of foul language, possibly even advocating genocide? Does that get defended by the harm principle? Does that kind of thing itself count as a harm? Are there certain sorts of actions that we might think of as not directly causing a harm, but somehow indirectly end up causing harms that ought to be limited in some sense? These are exactly the sorts of questions we're going to see Young pick up in the next lecture in her piece, The 5 Faces of Oppression. So that's going to be a 20th century look at how adopting the sorts of very wide, broad freedoms that Mill is arguing for here can actually result in certain sorts of harms to people within minority groups, which is precisely the sort of thing Mill was trying to prevent. So in the next lecture, that'll be up on Wednesday, we're going to take a look at Young's 5 Faces of Oppression and see what sorts of reasons she gives us to take a bit more of an expansive view of the harm principle and to at least think about having the government intervene in some sort of coercive fashion in people's actions and people's, what seems like the area they should be free to do what they want in, according to Mill, precisely because in some sense, maybe Mill has been missing something. So I hope you've enjoyed this lecture and I hope you're all doing well. We're in our last week of class here, so we've only got really one more lecture to get through. And then there's, of course, the critical response due at the end of the week. And I'll have some more information on the exam later in the week as well. So I'll see you all on Wednesday. Bye for now.